This is a map showing the percentage of adults who are highly religious in each European country. Looking at it, you will notice that Eastern Europe is much more religious than Western Europe. In fact, on average, Eastern Europeans are 5 times more likely to feel highly religious compared to their Western counterparts. But why is that? Why is this part of Europe so much more religious than the rest? I mean, it was the Western European countries that were responsible for the global spread of Christianity, but now it is marked by empty churches and rising secularism. So what's happened, and why is this gap only going to increase? Well, to explain this reversal of religion, we must first go back, and I mean all the way back, 2,000 years to the formation of Christianity in the 1st century. Christianity originated in Judea, part of the Roman Empire in what is now Israel and Palestine. Its message of hope and salvation appealed to many, particularly those on the margins of society. Aided by the Roman efficient transportation and communication networks, this blossoming religion took off like wildfire throughout the empire. By the 4th century, Christianity had become the main religion of the Roman Empire, and only a few years later, a decision would be made that is crucial to answering our question. In the year 395, the Roman Empire was officially split into the East and West. This was mainly done to address the difficulties in ruling such a large realm. Crucially, the Western Empire became predominantly Latin-speaking, while the Eastern Empire, later known as Byzantium, was centered around the Greek language. This division helped control the empire, but also reinforced the cultural divide. Over the next centuries, the East and West Roman Empire's religious views began to differ. In the West, there was the Pope, where he was the head of the church. However, in the East, at the capital of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, there were growing religious differences. They had the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was in charge of the church in the Eastern Roman Empire and made all the important decisions for the region. Despite this, on paper, he still served under the Pope, and there began to be growing differences between the two figures. Essentially, these differences kept building up to the point where there were 2 clear different denominations of Christianity: the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. For example, the Orthodox Church is much more traditional, and they also believe that the Son in the Holy Trinity, which is in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that the Son should not proceed after the Holy Spirit. They believe that the Catholic Church shoehorned in the Son against the teachings from the original Church Fathers. These differences, along with political rivalries, continued to rise until the Great Schism in the 11th century, where the Orthodox Church officially separated from the Roman Catholic Church. The separation is even in effect today, 970 years later. This is why most of Eastern Europe, such as Moldova, Serbia, Ukraine, Romania, and if you consider it Eastern Europe, then Greece, are Orthodox Christian countries instead of being Catholic Christian countries. So Eastern Europe is Orthodox. Orthodox Christians are more religious than Catholics? Question answered. Well, no. Despite the name and common perceived understanding, Orthodox Christians are much more laid back in many ways compared to Catholics. And they are not just automatically more religious because they are Orthodox. Also, Poland and Croatia are 2 of the most religious countries in Europe, yet both Catholic countries. So to truly answer the question of why Eastern Europe is much more religious than Western Europe, we must continue to dig further. So 4 centuries after the Great Schism, the Eastern Roman Empire, now called the Byzantine Empire, fell in the 15th century due to the Ottoman Empire conquest of Constantinople. Eastern Europe now had new Muslim rulers, and the power base of the Orthodox Christian Church was moved to Moscow. The Ottomans stayed in power relatively unchecked for another 400 years. However, the people in Eastern Europe still maintained their strong Orthodox faith, which was a key distinguishing feature compared to their foreign overlords. On the other side of Europe, the Western Roman Empire had fallen hundreds of years earlier, but it was now controlled by the Catholic superpowers of the French, English, and Spanish, with the Pope sitting firmly at the head of the church. Christianity dominated the region, which was the opposite in the East. The Orthodox countries surrounding the Ottoman Empire finally had enough by the start of the 20th century. Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, each being allied by religion and common cause, wanted to push the Ottomans out of Eastern Europe and declared war on the empire in 1912. This was known as the First Balkan War, The Ottomans were already in decline, and the combined forces of the Orthodox nations were far too strong. By 1913, 1 year later, the Balkans won the war and kicked the Ottomans out of Europe and finally regained their independence. But this foreign occupation for over 500 years had left Eastern Europe much poorer and underdeveloped compared to their Western counterparts. Not only had Catholicism dominated the West, but they had been able to explore the New World, trading and starting colonies, as well as making countries such as Spain, Portugal, England, and France very rich. This also allowed them to spread Catholicism globally. By the end of the 19th century, most Western European countries had empires with land in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Their countries were deep into industrializing, and cities were expanding rapidly. Again, it is important to emphasize, this was in stark contrast to Eastern Europe, which was still very agriculturally driven, with most people living in rural villages. But then the most important event in the story took place, and I promise this will all tie in together. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and began World War II. All of Europe was thrown into war. 6 years later, the Allies won the war, but all of Europe was completely devastated. Britain, France, and West Germany were desperate for workers to rebuild their industries and infrastructure. This led to significant immigration into these countries. Moreover, they also began to decolonize after the war, which meant many people from former colonies migrated to Western Europe. For example, people from the Caribbean, India, and Pakistan moved to the United Kingdom, while people from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia migrated to France. But in the East, there was a new problem. These countries had also been devastated by the war, but instead of receiving an influx of workers and financial aid from the US, a wave of communist influence swept over the land. Stalin and the USSR took control of countries such as Poland, Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Further south, Josip Broz Tito, also a communist dictator, took power in Yugoslavia, which was formed of these modern-day countries: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Kosovo. There was one Eastern European country to escape communist rule. Greece, right after World War II in 1946 to 1949, fought a brutal civil war between communist forces against the government forces. The government forces did win after being heavily supported by the US, and so the country became a capitalist state where religion was able to flourish. On the other hand, the communist Eastern European countries enforced state atheism as part of their ideological framework. Religion was seen as incompatible with communist principles, which emphasized the collective over the individual and materialism over spirituality. This began in Russia first, where the Orthodox Church power base had moved after the collapse of Constantinople. Stalin effectively and brutally persecuted the Orthodox Church in order to decrease its influence. For example, in 1917, there were 50,000 churches in the Russian Empire, but by 1939, this had dropped to only 200. But this was only the beginning of what was to come. The Great Purge in 1936 to 1938 saw Stalin order the arrest of thousands of clergy and, in many cases, had them executed. One of the most prominent figures was Metropolitan Pyotr of Krutitsy. He became head of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1925, but was quickly arrested and then sent in exile the same year for not agreeing with the communists' aim to control all religion in Russia. Despite being in exile for 12 years, Metropolitan Pyotr remained a symbol of resistance to Soviet control over the church, so in 1937 they decided to arrest him again during the Great Purge. However, this time Stalin went one step further. Pyotr was accused of anti-Soviet activities and counter-revolutionary actions. These charges were typical of the fabricated accusations used to justify the arrests. The punishment for these crimes was death, and Pyotr, the acting head of the Russian Orthodox Church, was executed by the firing squad. This was just one example of Stalin's stance on religion, and he planned on taking the same action throughout all of communist Eastern Europe. In Soviet-controlled Ukraine during 1946, Stalin ordered the forced liquidation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The UGCC was the largest Eastern Catholic Church, and it was seen as a threat because of its loyalty to the Pope and its influence in Western Ukraine. Another example is in Poland, where there was a serious crackdown on the Catholic Church. Religious education was banned, and many priests were arrested and deported to Siberia. This was happening all over Eastern Europe in the communist-controlled countries. Now, you might assume then, if religion was so heavily censored and persecuted in Eastern Europe during this time, wouldn't that lead to its decrease? Well, It actually did the opposite. During the prosecution, many churches moved underground. In fact, this was so widespread that it even has its own name, called catacomb church, meaning churches performed underground. Masses and ceremonies were held in private locations, often homes, forests, and even barns all across Eastern Europe. And this was done for both Catholic and Orthodox Christians alike. Both the Catholic Church in countries such as Poland and Lithuania, and the Orthodox countries such as Ukraine, Serbia, and Bulgaria had very strong personal identity tied to their religion. These churches were seen as guardians of the nation's traditions, language, and identity, making them resilient in the face of repression. Moreover, the 500-year rule by the Ottomans, where the church had played an important role in the collapse of the Ottoman occupation, also strengthened people's national identity to their religion. Ultimately, this led to the complete failure of communism to stamp out religion, and when the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia both fell in the early 1990s, religion almost immediately reappeared and flourished in Eastern Europe. The 50-year occupation by the communist powers on the East further allowed the link between religion and personal identity to strengthen significantly, because it helped them differentiate themselves from the foreign invaders. This link of personal identity to religion is one of the main reasons why Eastern European countries are more religious compared to the West. For example, today 76% of Greeks say being Orthodox is important to be a real Greek, or 64% of Polish people say that being Catholic is important to be a true Pole. Moreover, the foreign occupation kept Eastern Europe much poorer compared to the West, and so they were not able to form empires around the world. However, once countries such as France and Britain decolonized, people from these former colonies migrated to these Western countries, bringing with them different religions and cultures. As a result, this diluted the Catholic Church's influence over Western Europe and their ability to enforce religious conformity. This was exacerbated during communist rule, where Eastern European countries' borders were locked down, whereas in the West, they wanted to quickly rebuild after the war, and so immigration boomed as they wanted more workers. As a result, Eastern Europe, which even to this day has seen very little diversity or immigration, resulting in complete religious conformity and further strengthening the country's religious beliefs. Finally, once the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia fell, churches in Eastern Europe were now able to operate freely. This led to a complete revival of religion in these countries, with the construction and repair of churches and reintroduction of religious education into schools. This had a clear impact. For example, look at the increase of church attendance after 1991 in both Russia and Romania. This revival is the third reason why Eastern Europe is much more religious than the West today. It is ironic because despite the West having no restrictions on religion, this has ultimately led to a steady decline, whereas the complete reversal happened in the East. And this gap between the East and West is only likely to increase. The Western countries have almost no real link between national identity and religion, as well as continuing to have huge immigration numbers. Compare this to Eastern European countries, where immigration has stayed relatively minimal throughout the 21st century, and the link between national identity and religion has stayed strong. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about interesting places in the world, then click here to watch.